The Galactic Research Collective Xenobiology Station Ouroboros 7 was, by any measurable standard, one of the most secure facilities in the known galaxy. It sat in the gravitational dead zone between two brown dwarfs at the edge of the Kepler expanse, chosen specifically because nothing wanted to be there. No shipping lanes, no habitable worlds within 6 light years. No reason for anything living to be in that particular pocket of cold, unremarkable space unless it was either studying something dangerous or being something dangerous. The station had 17 species on staff, 4 rotating research divisions, and enough redundant containment architecture to hold, according to its own brochure, any known biological entity at any recorded threat classification. That brochure had been written before they caught the Vreth. They'd added a footnote after. Then a second footnote. Then a full supplemental document that was mostly just the word please formatted in increasingly desperate fonts. The Vreth designation Subject Kael-7, though no one on staff called it that to its face, because doing so felt like announcing yourself as a snack, was the apex predator of the Terith expanse. 8 limbs, each tipped with keratin composite blades that could score durasteel plating, armored carapace capable of deflecting directed energy at standard sidearm yield, bioluminescent chromatophores across its dorsal surface that it used for threat display, camouflage, and, according to 3 separate xenobiologists who had all subsequently requested reassignment, something that felt uncomfortably like mockery. The worst part, the part that made it genuinely unique among apex predators in the GRC database, was the low-grade telepathic resonance field it projected when agitated. Not communication, not exactly. More like a broadcast, a primal signal that hit the limbic system of every known sentient species like a fist and said, simply and clearly, run. Every known sentient species. There was, as of 6 months ago, one exception. Dr. Kofi Osei, Xenobiological Cultural Liaison, represented humanity's first formal placement within a GRC research station. He was 34 years old, originally from Accra, had a doctorate in comparative animal cognition from the University of Edinburgh, and had been assigned to Ouroboros 7, in the same spirit that you might assign a child to shadow a surgeon. Not because anyone expected him to contribute meaningfully, but because the paperwork said someone had to, and it seemed harmless enough. He had a laugh that echoed down the research corridors. He had introduced the concept of hot sauce to the station galley, which had resulted in a formal complaint from the Dravathi contingent, and a quiet, deeply enthusiastic follow-up inquiry from the Sorelian chef. He had also, on his 3rd day aboard, walked directly up to Subject Kael-7's enclosure, pressed his hand flat against the transparent steel, and said, "Oh, you're beautiful." The Vreth had activated a full threat display. Kofi had tilted his head and said, Yeah. Dr. Sethrick, a senior pollution xenobiologist with 4 decades of field experience and a professional reputation he considered carefully maintained, had pulled him back from the glass and explained, at length, and with what he privately felt was remarkable composure, that Subject Kael-7 had killed 3 drones, collapsed 1 remote observation booth, and once caused a trained GRC containment specialist to lose consciousness purely from proximity-induced terror response. Kofi had listened politely. Then he'd looked back at the enclosure. "It's got a scratch on the 3rd left limb," he said. "Has anyone logged that?" Sethrick had gone back to his lab and sat quietly for a while. The micrometeorite was 4.3 centimeters in diameter. It was traveling at 0.003% the speed of light, not fast enough to trigger perimeter defense systems, which were calibrated for objects that pose structural risk. It punched through an unmapped gap in the station's outer hull, skipped off a coolant conduit, and detonated the primary relay node for Containment Grid C. The explosion was small. The consequences were not. Ouroboros 7's emergency systems did exactly what they were designed to do. Blast doors came down across 12 corridors. Emergency lighting shifted to red. The station's VI began cycling through evacuation protocols in 6 languages simultaneously, which produced, in the opinion of everyone experiencing it, an effect roughly equivalent to being shouted at by a bureaucrat while your house was on fire. Containment Grid C managed 6 specimens. 5 of them registered at threat level 4 or below. Their secondary containment held automatically. Subject Kael-7 was classified threat level 9. Its secondary containment was electromagnetic in nature. Electromagnetic systems drew from the same relay node. The enclosure door opened with a soft, hydraulic sigh, like a polite announcement. In the main research corridor, Dr. Sethric was already moving toward the emergency pods. Around him, the station crew, a Dravathi materials analyst, 2 Sorelian biologists, a pollution engineer, and a Thressi communications specialist were doing the same, with the specific efficient urgency of people who have drilled evacuation procedures enough times that fear and training have become indistinguishable. The VI was very clear on protocol. Containment breach, threat level 7 or above, all personnel evacuate to sealed pods. Engage lockdown, await GRC response team. Do not attempt engagement. Do not attempt communication. Do not, under any circumstances, remain in open corridors. Sethric grabbed the nearest crew member, the Dravathi analyst, Krival, and pulled him toward Pod Bay 2. He counted heads as he ran. He counted again. "Where?" he said, with the particular stillness of someone whose brain had just delivered extremely unwelcome news. "Is Dr. Osei?" Kofi had heard the alarm. He'd also heard the hydraulic sigh from Containment Grid C because he'd been in the adjacent lab reviewing behavioral footage when the power fluctuated, and he recognized the sound. He'd asked about the enclosure mechanisms in his first week. He asked about most things. People had mostly stopped being surprised by the questions and started being vaguely unsettled by them. He stood up from his workstation. He looked at the door to the corridor. He went left. Pod Bay 2 was to the right. This was not an accident. Later, when asked to explain his reasoning, by Sethric, by a GRC review board, by a collective intelligence officer who'd flown in specifically to ask the question, he would describe it the same way each time, in the same slightly distracted tone, as though he was explaining why he'd taken an unusual route to the cafeteria. "I wanted to see what it did when it wasn't behind glass." The GRC officer had stared at him for a long time. "That's it?" he'd said. Kofi had said, "I also figured it probably wasn't going to go for the most open, well-lit part of the station immediately. Apex predators with territorial instincts usually consolidate before they move. It'd want to understand the space first." Another long stare. "You're describing tactical behavior prediction for a threat level 9 predator. I'm describing what my neighbor's German Shepherd does when we let her off the leash in a new park." But that was later. In the moment, Kofi moved down the corridor toward Grid C with his hands loose at his sides and his breathing slow, because he'd learned a long time ago, in fields in Ghana as a kid, in veterinary observation labs in Edinburgh, in every place he'd ever been where something large and frightened had too many teeth, that the most dangerous thing you could do around an animal operating on fear was act like prey. And the second most dangerous thing was run. He rounded the corner to the Grid C access corridor and stopped. The Vreth was at the far end. 20 meters away. All 8 limbs spread wide, tips down against the deck, plating in a posture he'd seen in the footage hundreds of times. Its chromatophores had gone full nova, cascading bioluminescence rolling across its carapace in waves of red and gold. A display that, according to every piece of research Ouroboros 7 had produced, existed for exactly one purpose. It meant, I will end you. This is your only warning. The telepathic resonance field hit him like a warm breeze. He'd experienced it before through the enclosure glass. The pollution engineers called it the fear broadcast. Every sentient species in the GRC database registered some version of a fight or flight cascade in proximity to an agitated Vreth. The intensity scaled with proximity. At 20 meters with no shielding, Sethric had once told him even a trained specialist would be on the floor. Kofi felt it the way he'd once described to a confused Sorelian biologist. Like that feeling when you're watching a scary movie and the music gets tense. You know something's there. You feel it. But you also know you're on the couch. He crouched down. Slowly. Elbows on his knees, hands open, eyes tracking slightly to the side of the Vreth rather than directly at it, because direct eye contact at distance was a dominant signal in more species than it wasn't. Then he made a sound, low and soft. The kind of sound that didn't have a name in any clinical literature, but that every human being who'd ever sat with a frightened animal knew instinctively. A small, meaningless, rhythmic sound that said, I am here. I am not leaving. I am not a threat. The Vreth's chromatophores flickered. It didn't charge. This was, from a purely statistical standpoint, extraordinary. Subject Kael-7 had charged every stimulus introduced to it since capture. Drones, probes, reinforced observation barriers. Once, memorably, its own reflection in a polished containment panel, which it had subsequently destroyed so thoroughly that the cleanup team had needed 3 days and a specialist from the GRC Metallurgy Division. It did not charge Kofi. It held its spread posture, luminescence rolling, and it looked at him. Not the threat assessment scan it ran on drones that was fast, mechanical, ending in a lunge. This was something different. Slower. The massive head tilted on its anterior limbs, the sensory clusters along its jaw ridge fanning slightly open. It was reading him. He let it. He stayed crouched, hands open, breathing steady, and he read it back. Because Kofi Osei had spent 20 years looking at animals, really looking, not cataloging, not classifying, but looking. And what he saw in the Vreth's posture wasn't just threat. Threat was the surface. Underneath it was something he'd seen in every species he'd ever worked with, from the smallest to the most dangerous. Pain. He'd noticed the scratch on the third left limb in his first week. What he was seeing now was worse than a scratch. The micrometeorite impact had sent a pressure wave through Grid C before the door opened, and somewhere in that sequence, something had cracked. A plate of carapace along the Vreth's left dorsal flank. He could see it from here, dark against the bioluminescent display. An irregular seam that hadn't been in last week's footage, leaking hemolymph. Dark and slow, but leaking. It was loose, it was in a strange space, and it was hurt. The threat display wasn't aggression. Not entirely. It was the specific cocktail Kofi had learned to recognize over 2 decades of working with animals that didn't have the option of words, "Come closer, and I'll make you regret it," wrapped around a core of "Please don't make this worse." "Hey," he said softly. "I see it. The side. That looks bad." The Vreth's luminescence shifted. A ripple across the gold towards something cooler. He reached into his jacket pocket. He carried ration bars the way he carried most things, habitually. because the station's meal schedule didn't always align with his interest in eating at scheduled times, and also because he'd found early on that food was a useful social instrument in environments where you were the new and unfamiliar thing. He broke the bar in half, the snap of it audible in the silent corridor, and set one half on the deck plating in front of him. Then he waited. The Vreth looked at the bar, looked at him. The sensory clusters along its jaw worked slowly, tasting the air. 30 seconds passed, then a minute. The luminescence dropped by half. The spread limbs drew in, not fully, but enough. A posture shift so small that anyone without Kofi's specific obsessive 20 years in the field eye for it would have missed it entirely. It stepped forward. Not fast. Not a predator's lunge. One limb, then another. A careful and deliberate movement that covered 3 meters before it stopped again. It was close enough now that he could see the individual segments of its carapace. The way the chromatophores sat in the channels between them like fiber optic threads. Close enough that he could hear the subsonic resonance it was projecting. Lower now. Different in character from the threat broadcast. Something he didn't have a name for yet. It looked at the ration bar. It looked at his hand. He moved his hand forward. Slowly. Placed it near the bar on the deck. The Vreth went very still. Then it lowered its head. The jaw-ridge sensory clusters touched his hand, not the blades, the clusters, the sensitive array, and it was the gentlest thing he'd felt since he'd boarded this station. Like being investigated by something that was, despite every physical feature it possessed, being careful. He let out a breath he hadn't entirely known he was holding. "There you go," he said quietly. "I'm not interesting. I know. I'm very boring. You can relax." He let the contact hold for another moment. Then, slowly, he moved his hand to the cracked carapace plate on its flank. He didn't touch it directly. He hovered. Let it feel the proximity. Let it decide. It turned toward his hand rather than away from it. He touched the edge of the cracked plate, feather light, and the Vreth made a sound that resonated somewhere below his sternum and bypassed language entirely. Not a threat, not a call. Something older than either. He stayed there for 47 minutes. He knew the number because he checked his comm afterward. It had not felt like 47 minutes. It had felt like the specific kind of time that exists outside of clocks. The way a good conversation does. Or the moment before a storm breaks. The GRC Rapid Response Team was 12 specialists in full containment gear, equipped with Class 4 suppression fields, long-range tranquilizer systems, and the most sophisticated xenopredator management technology the Collective had produced in the last century. They had deployed from the nearest relay station in 4 hours, which was a record. They were exceptionally well prepared. They breached the station through the emergency access port on level 3, swept the main corridor in formation, and rounded the corner to the Grid C access passage with suppression fields active and targeting systems live. They found Kofi sitting cross-legged on the deck. The Vreth was curled against the wall beside him. Not restrained, not sedated. Curled. The 8 limbs folded beneath the armored body in a configuration the GRC database had no record of Subject Kael-7 ever demonstrating. Because Subject Kael-7 had never previously been in a state that could be described as resting. Its chromatophores were dim and slow, cycling through a pattern of deep blue and low amber. The subsonic resonance filled the corridor like the world's most alarming ambient music. The team lead, a pollution specialist named Vorth Ka, 22 years in Xenopredator containment, decorated 3 times for crisis management, lowered his targeting system by approximately 2 centimeters, then raised it again. Then lowered it. Kofi looked up at them. Hey, keep the suppression fields low. The M component is going to irritate the wound site. A silence descended over the response team that had a specific quality. The quality of 12 highly trained professionals simultaneously confronting the possibility that their entire professional framework had a gap in it. Dr. Osei, Vorith Ka said carefully, "Please move away from the specimen." In a minute, Kofi was doing something with a piece of equipment. A modified tissue scanner he'd apparently pulled from the adjacent lab at some point during the 47 minutes. "I want to get a read on the hemolymph loss before we move it." "The crack is deep. Dr. Osei, that is a threat level 9. I know what it is." He said it pleasantly. "Can someone get me a trauma kit?" "The carapace sealant compound? It'll be in the Xenobiology emergency supplies yellow case." The team lead looked at his team. His team looked back at him. No one had trained for this. Sethric, who had arrived with the response team and had been standing at the back of the formation because he decided that was a reasonable place for someone with his particular feelings about the situation, pushed forward slowly and looked around the corner. He looked for a long time. Then he walked back to the emergency pod bay, sat down on a storage crate, and stared at the middle distance. 2 of his pollution colleagues found him there 10 minutes later. "He's treating its wound," he said. They waited. "It's letting him." "More waiting." "I have been studying xenobiology for 41 years, Sethric said, in the tone of a man reviewing the foundational assumptions of his career and finding several of them suddenly suspect. "I have a published paper on breath threat response. I cited in that paper," I stated, "as a conclusion supported by 11 years of observational data that the breath threat cascade is an irreversible behavioral sequence once initiated. It does not de-escalate. It terminates." His colleague said nothing. "He made a noise at it," Sethric said. "Like a soft noise. Like something you do with a small animal." And it stopped. In the debrief that followed, a formal GRC session that lasted 2 days and produced a report that was subsequently classified, then partially declassified, then reclassified with a different color cover, Sethric was asked to characterize the human's behavior during the incident. He thought about it for a while. He was not afraid, he said finally. The reviewing officer noted this. "The telepathic resonance field affected him." "Yes," he confirmed he felt it. Sethric paused. He described it as tense background music. He said it made him want to, and I am quoting directly, "move carefully." Not flee, not freeze, careful. The reviewing officer wrote something down. "We have," Sethric continued, 46 years of breath observational data. The fear broadcast has a 100% documented efficacy rate across every tested species. Every species for which we have data. And humans? We didn't test it on humans. We didn't think," he stopped. "We didn't think it was relevant. There are pre-expansion species, physical threat metrics at the low end of the sentient range, no telepathic capability, no recorded history of interaction with breath class predators. We assess them as, the honest answer is that we didn't assess them. There was nothing in the data to flag." The reviewing officer looked up from his notes. And yet, Sethric agreed. The formal GRC report on the Ouroboros 7 containment incident was filed 12 days later by senior xenobiologist Vorith Ka, running to 43 pages of incident documentation, behavioral analysis, biological assessment, and protocol review. The Vreth's carapace wound had been successfully treated. Recovery was projected at 6 weeks. Subject Kael-7 had been returned to its enclosure. This had required negotiation. Not with the Vreth. The Vreth had been cooperative, in the specific way of an animal that has decided, through its own opaque reasoning, that a particular situation is acceptable. The negotiation had been with station management, because Subject Kael-7 had declined to enter its enclosure until a particular condition was met. The condition was the presence of Dr. Kofi Osei in the adjacent observation room. Once Kofi was visible through the transparent steel, the Vreth had walked calmly into its enclosure, turned twice in what several observers described as an extremely domestic fashion, and settled into the resting configuration that no one had previously recorded it performing. Its chromatophores, cycling through that slow pattern of blue and amber. The station's behavioral VI had flagged this as anomalous and issued a warning. Sethric had deleted the warning. The report's appendix contained updated threat classifications, revised containment protocols, and a recommendation for further research into what Vorith Ka had formally designated as the Osei effect, a placeholder title that he'd expected to be replaced in editing and that had instead made it through 4 review stages entirely intact, because no one on the review board had a better one. The final paragraph of the report read as follows. It is the finding of this review that the incident at Ouroboros 7 presents a significant gap in collective xenobiological threat modeling. The human subject demonstrated no measurable fear response, initiated successful non-aggressive contact with a threat level 9 specimen, performed rudimentary wound assessment and first aid, and achieved a behavioral de-escalation that no GRC-trained specialist has accomplished in 46 years of Vreth research. Physical metrics remain at pre-expansion baseline. Telepathic sensitivity registers at 0. No combat augmentation. No specialized containment training. Psychological profiling indicates no anomalous risk tolerance. The subject describes his own behavior as, quote, pretty normal for someone who grew up around dogs. Revised threat assessment for the human species is pending. Current assessment. Insufficient data. Recommends significant expansion of research scope. Priority classification. Urgent. Attached to the report, flagged as supplemental and not for general distribution, was a 12-second security footage clip. It showed Kofi in the observation room adjacent to Grid C. The Vreth was at the glass on the other side. Kofi had his palm flat against the transparent steel. The Vreth had its anterior sensory cluster pressed against the same spot from the other side. Kofi was talking. The audio was too low to capture fully. The VI's lip-reading algorithm, running at 94% accuracy, produced 2 words. Good boy. Somewhere across 6 light years of cold and unremarkable space, in offices and research stations and government chambers that Kofi Osei had never visited and whose occupants had never given humanity a second thought, 47 xenobiologists, 9 intelligence analysts, and 1 very senior collective official who had personally signed off on humanity's admission as a low-priority observer species were reading that report. They were all thinking variations of the same thought. The thought was not about the Vreth. Back on Ouroboros 7 in the observation room beside Grid C, Kofi was sitting cross-legged on the floor with his back against the transparent steel. On the other side of the glass, 8 limbs folded. Chromatophores dim and slow in the blue-amber cycle. The most feared predator in the known galaxy was pressed against the wall as close to him as the barrier would allow. He was eating the other half of the ration bar. He was reading a paper on Vreth carapace regeneration that Sethric had forwarded him, making notes in the margins. He was completely unbothered. The GRC database had a field for apex predator designations. It had another field, used rarely, for species that had demonstrated the capacity to handle apex predators, a category that required, historically, either overwhelming technological advantage, exceptional telepathic capability, or both. Someone, in an office 6 light years away, was opening that field and typing a new entry into it for the first time in 30 years. They typed human. They stared at it for a while. Then they saved the file, stood up, walked to the window of their office, and looked out at a galaxy that had, as of approximately 47 minutes on a cold station in the Kepler expanse, become slightly more complicated than it had been the day before.